there, I think, is a lot, to some extent, that's lost in film over the literature experience. But then again, people tend to read one person with the text. It's very intimate. Whereas, you know, if you're in a theater, you're there with a couple hundred people on a good night for the theater. Since you've reviewed both literature and film, I was wondering how you perceived those differences and addressed them.
Well, they are. I look at cinema sort of as an extension of literature to a degree. I think cinema is more literature with pictures than it is pictures with words, in that it uses a lot of the techniques of literature. A movie can obviously do things that a novel can't do. That you can have a moment. I interviewed this guy who uh, runs a comic book organization a few weeks ago, and I gave a good example in comic books about how you can have a visual image that would take 2, 3, 5 pages of sterling prose to get to. So there are some advantages that the visual image has. The advantages that literature has is depth and breadth and the full scope. Of course, there are writers, and probably the most prominent example I can give is Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, that every adaptation in film of a Philip K. Dick work that I have ever seen is better than the original Philip K. Dick, because Dick himself had ideas, and he had some interesting ideas. You know, he had some interesting ideas about society, about the human condition and whatnot, but he had no ability to get inside human beings. His characters are marionettes. His characters are all these insensate beings that just move. They are shadows on the wall. There's nothing deep inside them. And if you look at some of his adaptations, I reviewed Blade Runner. I don't think it's a great masterpiece like a lot of people do, but it's a better film than the Dick work that it's based upon. Same way with like Total Recall, Minority Report. They're probably the three most famous adaptation of Dick's work. There have been some others on screen, but he wrote these very cardboard characters, and the films could come in and add to that, because most of his work is based upon short stories. When you look at, for example, adaptations of novels, they almost always are lesser. There are a few examples that are different. I had mentioned The Thin Red Line. The James Jones novel is a good, solid war novel. You could make an argument that it's one of the better war novels of the World War II experience, up there with The Naked and the Dead and by Norman Mailer. But the Malick film succeeds because it goes totally away from it. Malick infuses into that his own sensibility. It deepens, it gives a resonance that's beyond just the gritty reality of war. And it starts from the very first image in that film of a crocodile descending into an algae laden river. And there was another film that just flipped. Oh, The Shining is another great example. Kubrick. If you read the original, I think it's a short story, or maybe it's a novel. I think it's a short story that The Shining King wrote. King famously hated it, which doesn't surprise. Hated Kubrick's adaptation, and they did a terrible late '90s, I think, miniseries based on or a two-part movie based on King's book. But the Kubrick film is so superior. The Kubrick film again adds a richness and a depthness and a depth that isn't in the original book. But when you look at really great literature, I don't know of any adaptation of Huckleberry Finn on film that is equal to it. Probably the only classic book that I can think of that the film was close to or equal to or better is probably the adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. Now that's a children's book, and I remember reading it as a child. And then when I was about 20, I saw the Canadian adaptation with Megan Follows, and that's an actress who's a great actress who one of these days I'm going to try to interview. But that was such a rich adaptation. It took the best of the book, it went beyond the childlike nature of it, and it made it resonant for adults as well. But aside from that, I can't. I've seen the couple of Moby-Dick versions. They're not on par with the book. So the difference between cinema and literature basically is that literature has the depth. Cinema, in a sense, is more like poetry in that you can take an image, a little flickering image, turn it on a dime, and you can have a metaphor. Cinema can more quickly reach into you and get you at an emotional level. There are tearjerker films. The most famous one was the 1983 film that with Nicholson and Shirley MacLaine. What's the one, the real weepy one? Written by Larry McMurtry, I think it was. I can't remember the name of it, but
Endearment.
What?
Terms of Endearment.
Terms of Endearment. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think that was Larry McMurtry. But I'll tell you, a great work of art, and one of the few times I've maybe cried a half a dozen to a dozen times of all the hundreds or thousands of films that I've seen. One of the times that I cried was in 2001: A Space Odyssey, when after he's been locked out of the spaceship by Hal the computer, the Keir Delay character Bowman makes his way back into the spaceship, and basically it's a countdown to Hal's death, and you can hear Hal saying, Dave, what are you doing, Dave? What are you doing, Dave? Dave goes into this giant reddish-hued computer room, and he starts slowly pulling out, I guess, the cartridges. Again, this is 1968, so they have these huge cartridges, and slowly but surely, Hal starts regressing back to his childlike state, and he starts singing a song. And then eventually, when Hal is kaput, we see the video that says why they were really sent on this mission. But I remember thinking to myself, how sad it was. Here I'm watching de facto what seems to be a murder, and it's a justifiable homicide, because Hal has killed one of the other astronauts. Hal has killed the sleeping astronauts. Hal has clearly gone psychopathic. Yet, in just a handful of scenes with this monotonous voice, the writing, the way, the writing of Kubrick, the way it was filmed, the people talk that 2001 and the Kubrick was emotionless. What the fuck are they watching? 2001, that's a devastating scene. And I remember as a 10 or 11-year-old watching that on the late night movie, I think in 75 or 76, and being really saddened and choking up, because here is a sentient creature, a creature that in some ways is probably greater than mankind, and yet he has stumbled and he has fallen into an abyss, and now he's being executed. And that said something about the nature of life, the nature of fallibility, that even this supposedly infallible being or creature or sentience has failed, and that's what film can do. And it would be, and I've read 2001, the book, and the scene of Hal being disconnected is nowhere near as effective. So each of them have their pluses and minuses. I think overall that writing is the highest of the arts, simply because you have some etchings on a background, and these are totally abstract. I can make the letter B. You can recognize it as a B. I can recognize it as a B. Someone who doesn't know English doesn't mean anything. So you have these total abstractions that can, however, in a sequence of word, of sentence, of paragraph, of chapter, of book, of work, of play, or whatever, can be interpreted and can translate that thought that writer back 47 years ago, who may have written something, now has relevance. And that's an interesting thing, and it's a thing that even film can't do, because film is dependent upon the visual. It's a sensory medium. Yes, we have to look and be able to see the writing, or if on Braille, we'd have to be able to touch it, but it's not primarily sensual. It's abstract in the mind. So literature has the abstract advantage. Film has the evolutionarily wired advantage of sound and sight that can immediately affect. They are they in a sense, they are the yin and yang of art in being able to do that. So they both have their advantages. That's how I would define them.